Hello, everyone. I'm Nancy Letitia Marin, wine editor, copy editor, proofreader, and author at thelanguageagent.com. Fasten your seatbelt because it's going to be a bumpy ride today. We're covering a topic that no one in the publishing industry dares to discuss. You're in for a treat because we have Larken Rose, an internationally known author and speaker in the truth and freedom community, and an advocate for the principles of self-ownership, non-aggression, and a stateless society. Hey, Larken, thanks for joining us today. Good to see you again. It's been three years since I last saw you in Redlands.
Been a while, yeah.
Yeah, Candles in the Dark. That was awesome.
Glad you liked it.
Yeah. Good food.
That too, yeah.
Anarchists need food, and so just like everyone else. So first of all, let's talk about anarchy. People would go, "Ooh, anarchy, chaos, scary." What's anarchy really?
Well, to give the boring linguistic answer, it's from the Greek that means without, which is the and ruler, archy. So it literally means without a ruler. And it's funny that people think about it so rarely that they don't know how to process that idea. Like having no government, what are you talking about? And they don't realize that most of the time in their daily lives, that's what their life already is. Like, it's not like they have a cop looking over their shoulder 24/7. And most of us know how to interact without some big, scary authoritarian boss telling us what to do. But for some reason, people think it's so scary to imagine never having an authoritarian boss telling them what to do. And that makes it uncomfortable, even though most of their life, that's already how they live. It's already how they see things, and it's already how they function.
And as you can see, like even nowadays with with stuff that we shall not be named, this right here.
You got it. No.
Everybody's going underground, even those with licenses and everything. Now they see people underground. And their anarchism really kicks in, They're just great to see,
It's about time.
Yeah, and speaking of anarchy, what's voluntarism? Which I know it's related. So just explain it for those who are not familiar with the concept.
Sure, because the term anarchy and anarchism sound so scary to people, and they think like Molotov cocktails and stuff. I forget when it was, but somebody came up with the term voluntaryism, which is basically just a more specific and precise way to say the same thing. It's basically saying that we advocate that all human interaction be voluntary, not violent and not by coercion. It's not like we expect everyone to do that, but we only advocate voluntary interaction. And if somebody attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself and stuff. But so many people have been taught to believe that, well, we need government making us do certain things and stopping us from doing certain things, even when it has nothing to do with attacking anybody or hurting anybody. And so it's when you describe voluntarism as I want all human interaction to be voluntary instead of violent, almost everybody instinctively says, yeah, well, me too, duh. Who wouldn't want that? And they don't realize that they don't want that because they've been trained to believe that, yeah, when we're dealing with each other, we shouldn't be violent. It should be, by consent and stuff. But we need government to, forcibly dominate us. So it's a matter of just not thinking it through. But the term voluntarist is just sort of, it's a nicer way to express the same thing. And it expresses it in a way that almost everybody initially immediately agrees. Because who's going to be an involuntarist? I'm in favor of like violently attacking people. But that's the only other option. But it still requires an explanation for people to realize, oh yeah, if I believe in government, I'm not really a voluntarist. I really am an involuntarist. And so I use both terms because I think even though the term anarchy is scary, sooner or later it's going to come up anyway. So I'd rather start with the scary thing and explain why it isn't a scary thing. It just, the fact that it's usually associated with stuff that scares for chaos and mayhem, that's not what it actually means. So, but I understand how some people are like, let's avoid the scary sounding term and explain it in a way that people would be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's perfectly civilized.
Just like my shirt says, no masters, no slaves. There you go.
Yep. Very simple. Yep.
Yeah. And related to that, what's the non-aggression principle, or NAP? for short, NAP.
The non-aggression principle just dictates that it's wrong to initiate violence or force against another human being. And initiate is a really important word in the definition, because if somebody, it's not pacifism. If somebody attacks you, the non-aggression principle doesn't say you're not allowed to fight back. It says the attacker is wrong. It doesn't say the defender is wrong. So committing aggression, that's why it's not the non-violence principle. It's not the non-force principle. Yes. It's don't be the one who starts it. If somebody attacks you, you're allowed to defend yourself. But aggression specifically means you're the one who started it. You went out and you attacked somebody who wasn't doing anything to you. You weren't defending yourself. You weren't defending anybody. You were the aggressor. And the non-aggression principle is basically the idea that you shouldn't ever be the aggressor. Again, something very simple that most people in their daily lives are like, well, of course, like, duh, who doesn't know that? And the only time they don't know it is when it comes to politics and government, and they think, yes, well, that thing has to be an aggressor. So again, it's one of these principles that people instinctively embrace it anyway, except they think there's a big exception when it comes to political power.
Yeah, which we're going to talk about next. Just do no harm, take no shit. That's one. In your book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, I'm sorry, I'm tripping over words here. The Most Dangerous Superstition, you talk about the belief in authority. What is it exactly?
There's a few definitions of the term, and you can be like an authority on boll weevils or something. That just means you know a lot. But what I'm talking about when I bash the notion of authority is the idea that anyone can have the moral right to rule somebody else. And that's what authority means in that context. It doesn't just mean the ability, because, anybody with a gun in theory can rule somebody else. Doesn't make it okay. Authority is the notion that that person actually has the right, that it's legitimate for them to violently dominate somebody else. And the belief that that can ever be the case. And that's the foundation of the belief in government. That is the problem. That is the primary problem with human society right now, is people actually imagining that there's a way for someone to have the right to rule, for someone to have the right to be a master, not just the ability, but the right. And most people don't think in those terms, so they don't realize that most people totally believe that. If you believe in government and democracy and constitutions and legislation, then you believe that certain rituals and things give some people the moral right to rule others. And no, it doesn't.
Nope. And to understand what the myth of authority is all about, we need to know about legality versus morality. What's the difference between legality and morality? And also talk about objective morality and natural law.
Yeah, the difference is night and day, but people are intentionally raised and indoctrinated to not know the difference. It's like if there was, some evil control freak psycho in your town or in your family or something, and you were raised to think that obedience to them is the measure of whether you're a good person. Like, no, it isn't. But when we're taught that being law-abiding is the same as being good, and people will use the term like, I'm proud to be a law-abiding taxpayer, yes, as if that's something to be proud of, as if that means I'm a good person. Legality, all it means is it's in line with whatever the ruling class told me to do. Well, that might be good and it might be bad. If the ruling class said don't murder people and you don't murder people, okay, good. But that's not because there was a law about it. It's because murdering people is bad. But if the ruling class says, give us your money so we can fund other people to go murder people on the other side of the world, that's not good. But people have been trained to not see a distinction between literally what is right and wrong. And whether you believe in a God or however you get your own moral code, whatever you think is the source of right and wrong, to think that the source of right and wrong is politicians, well, that's just insane. And that is what people are taught to believe. And that's why they're taught to confuse legal with moral. So they genuinely believe that you're a bad person if you disobey a bunch of political parasites. To me, legality has absolutely nothing to do with what you should or shouldn't do. Like, sometimes it might match, a lot of the times it won't match. And in no case ever is politician legislation the reason something is right or wrong. They aren't gods. They're not even decent human beings.
No.
Gods. And so when people take legality into consideration when trying to figure out right and wrong, it's so sad. It's literal insanity.
Yeah, just like this law I read about many years ago. I don't know what state it was in. It was like you were not supposed to peel an orange in a hotel room or something. Yep, that's legality.
Yep. That's what's important in being a good human being. I think there's one where you're not allowed to sleep on top of a refrigerator either.
Or inside the fridge. There's the silliness of government or authority. There you go. If you guys want more proof.
Law, right.
Aren't you glad you're not a statist anymore?
Yeah.
Yeah. And as a former devout practitioner of a religion called statism within the right-wing denomination, how did you conclude that government was and still is irrational and immoral?
Well, it's sort of funny because so many people ask me like, well, what are your influences that made you turn into an anarchist? And there kind of weren't any. It was really a matter of arguing and debating and wanting to be consistent in my own position. So yeah, I was sort of constitutionalist, conservative, that general field of statism. And this was like a quarter of a century ago. And it occurred to me that my own arguments were inconsistent and didn't make any sense, because I would vehemently argue that you don't get to force me by way of taxation to fund some big welfare state or this thing over there or this thing over there. Like, I have the right to the fruits of my labor. And just because you call it law and taxation, that doesn't make it okay. And then at the same time, I was like, but we need taxes for like police, courts, and military and stuff. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized, now that's totally hypocritical. Okay, so taxes can't be involuntary. They can't be forced. Like, I don't have the right to force somebody to pay for something just because I think it's important. So government doesn't either. And I basically whittled away the things about government that were immoral until I got to the perfect ideal government and realized, oops, that isn't government anymore. It's just people being people, because I had whittled authority completely away, and now it's just human beings. And so most people I know got to anarchism either by practical reasons, because they figured out, well, this will work way better than this, or they heard people explaining it. I just sort of accidentally stumbled backwards into it by refining my own position until it was actually consistent, and then realizing, oops, what I advocate doesn't count as government anymore, which kind of accidentally makes me an anarchist. Whoops. Like, for me, it was never which of these works better. And I use this analogy a lot. It's like figuring out that Santa Claus isn't real. It's sort of weird to call yourself an anti-Santa Clausist, which is kind of what the term anarchist sounds like to me. It's like, no, I figured out that political authority can't be real. It can't be legitimate, and people pretending it can be has been the source of massive suffering and injustice. And I just sort of accidentally stumbled on the fact that, yeah, none of that's okay. None of that's moral and legitimate.
So completely by logic, 5 years ago, I discovered your work. That's how I convert. Thanks to you. But I was already going that way. It just needed confirmation. I didn't know what it was.
Right.
That's why we're doing this. Yeah, that's why we're doing this interview, to spread the message.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are what I refer to as default anarchists, which means they instinctively know a bunch of this, and they very quickly fall into realizing, well, yeah, obviously that. It's just they haven't necessarily heard it as a philosophy or coherently spelled out step by step. But they sort of, like, they instinctively know that politicians are all a bunch of crooks and that the whole game is a nightmare, but they sort of think, well, I guess we're stuck with that or something, and we, hope for the best or something. And so there are a bunch of people who are sort of, they're voluntarists waiting to happen.
Yes.
If somebody just spells it out in front of them. And I find more and more people fall into that category these days of they're already an inch away just because they instinctively know the whole game is just a horrible joke.
Yeah, especially what's going on right now, which I'm going to talk about next, and how and why has the belief in authority, the belief in government or statism, has caused everything to blow up in everyone's face right now, especially in the form of the current pandemic, or called plandemic or pandemic, a.k.a. the outbreak that shall not be verbally named. This one right here, again.
That one, be scared, be very afraid. This, I am astonished by what is going on, but not in the way most people would think. This is, I mean, it's horrendously offensive and ridiculous and stuff. But what really amazes me is this is the stupidest move I have ever seen the tyrants make. It is just, it's like watching somebody play chess and they just do the dumbest thing you can imagine. And you're like, did you try to do that? Because as damaging as it's going to be to decent people, and I think we're going to get into that in a bit.
Yeah.
This has caused so many normal people, you know, people who don't necessarily think about philosophy and politics and all that. They're just trying to live their lives and mind their own business, and they don't really care about any of that. And I can sympathize with that. Like, you know, they have their focus, they have their life, they have what they care about. But it's caused so many of them to sort of crash headlong into the insanity and evils of government, so that it just can't be avoided. Like, if, you know, 30 million people lose their jobs, some of them are going to notice, well, that was stupid and unnecessary. Who did this to me? And so a lot of people are suddenly crashing into the philosophical side of things and realizing this is totally bogus. How did we let them do this? And it's making them into, first of all, people who question things, and second of all, into anarchists who realize this isn't okay. You don't have the right to do this to me. And it just, it amazes me that they did something this stupid. And I still know a bunch of people in the freedom movement who think, no, they have some devious plan and they have everything under control. No, they don't. This is already so far out of their control. It's just amazing. Their own politicians, their own enforcers are duking it out, and a bunch of them are saying, right, enforce this. Their courts are going against them. The politicians are going against each other. The enforcers are going against all of them. And when my first book was called How to Be a Successful Tyrant. If you're a tyrant and your own underlings and enforcers are turning on you and disagreeing with you and saying, we're not going to do that, you're kind of doomed. And the fact that they're already doing this and they're trying to, you know, crack down over here and then back off over here, and they're trying to hang on to the game, and it's just this weird spectacle. In the meantime, a lot of decent people, their lives are going to be ruined. So it's horrendous. So I can't say this is a great thing, but in the midst of all the horribleness going on, and it's going to be horribleness around the world. Like, the U.S. is going to get the easy end of it, and it's going to be bad here, but it's going to be a lot worse in other places. But in between that, the ruling classes are making a bunch of people into rebels. It's just astonishingly stupid. But that part, I'm happy to see.
Oh, I'm so glad to see that too. Everybody's going underground, going on the black market, gray market.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be like the Soviet Union, where eventually the black market was the whole market. Because, like, nobody could afford to do things officially and legally. So they're all just like, well, heck you, I'll just do it when nobody's looking. And that's a great way to undermine an empire. I mean, look at what happened to the Soviet Union. One day it just sort of went because it had no control anymore. And I think that the USSA is heading in the same direction.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. The USSA. I've been saying that for many, many years.
It's very mirrored to to what we saw in the Soviet Union.
Way too many coincidences.
Yeah. Too many to be coincidences.
Yeah. And describe how the myth of authority affects the masters, order followers, or enforcers, targets, and spectators. This is all the stuff in your book.
Yeah.
Especially in relation to this.
Right. So you get this notion of legitimacy of power and legitimacy of rule, that government has the right to issue laws and we're all obligated to obey. That's the whole notion of authority in a nutshell. And my book, this one, The Most Dangerous Superstition, it goes through step by step how that belief affects everybody. Now, the people at the top, the politicians, they suddenly imagine, well, I get to do whatever I want, tell people to do whatever I want them to do. So you have these power-happy psycho, governors and mayors and whoever else saying, all right, nobody's allowed to leave their home, and I'm going to shut down all these businesses. And they think they have the right to do that. Because they believe in authority. If they were just themselves and you gave them a gun, they wouldn't go door to door and say, I'm just going to decide for you, like whether you can leave your house and whether you can run your business. It's only because they imagine themselves to be lawmakers and to have authority. And then underneath them, you get their enforcers, who will often just come right out and say, hey, I don't make the laws. I just enforce them. I'm just obeying orders. The Nuremberg defense that the Nazis used. And so they don't think that they're responsible for what they're actually doing. Again, a cop, never in a million years would the average cop just go door to door on his own if he didn't have a uniform and tell people whether they can open their business or step out of their house. But if law says it, their minds are so addled by the authoritarian indoctrination that they think, well, hey, it's the law. And they don't even think about what the hell that term even means. They just think, well, I have to go do this. It's my job to make you obey the law. And to me, those two categories aren't even the real problem. Because if you get a politician and a few thugs who think they have the right to do that, and a whole bunch of people who would say, yeah, no, you don't, they have no power. To me, the saddest part is that the belief in authority makes the victims of authoritarian injustice think that it's okay, think that it's necessary, and think that it's legitimate, and they go along with it. And in the thing that shall not be named going on right now, you can see it with all the Karens of the world out there saying, police, there's somebody who's closer than 6 feet to somebody else in a park. And because it's law, they actually think that you're a bad person if you disobey these arbitrary, just stupid, unnecessary things. But they've so been trained to respect an imaginary authority that A, they obey and they feel an obligation to obey, and they're doing things that are destructive to their own lives and destructive to the economy and millions of other people's lives. And B, they condemn anybody who doesn't. And I mean, you can see that really openly and honestly now, where people are just like, how don't you know there's an order that you're not allowed to blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And again, never in a million years would they have done that on their own. They'd never say, oh, I don't know, this virus is pretty bad. Maybe I should go start threatening people who aren't wearing a mask. That doesn't do any good. But if it's the law, suddenly they think you're bad. You're disobeying the law. And it's sad because the belief in authority basically takes a whole bunch of people, most of whom are decent enough people and otherwise intelligent, and it makes them into these sort of sad underlings of an authoritarian control freak. And it makes them, basically, they're helping their own abuser, and they're helping their abuser abuse other people too. And they think that that's a good thing because they think that that's being law-abiding and playing by the rules and yada, yada. And it's, to me, that's what's so creepy about it. It would be one thing if there's just, okay, there's some nasty people over here and they're attacking people over there, and those people like try to defend themselves. But when the nasty person can convince the victims that they should be victimized, that's what's just so sad to watch, and that's what the belief in authority does.
Very sad. I get scared too. I'm excited and scared at the same time, which is weird.
Yeah. I made a post recently that said things are getting much worse and much better at the same time, which is sort of confusing. Like economically, it's a catastrophe, but philosophically, a bunch of people are suddenly going, this doesn't seem right to me. It's like, okay, you're finally noticing.
Yeah, finally using their brains.
Yeah.
Yeah. And why do you think there are very few contemporary writers in the freedom and liberty movement, even within self-publishing? There are none that I know of in the traditional publishing industry. Do you have any theories on that? Because there's you, and there's this other libertarian lady in my professional circle. Usually musicians are more open, even though they're there are a lot of liberals in the music industry. So why do you think that is the case with writers? I mean, because a lot of people like in the industry are just a bunch of leftists, you know, they're too concerned about identity politics, following orders, and well, we're losing our freedoms and rights, you know, left and right. So is this because of academic conditioning, indoctrination? What's your theory?
I think there's a number of factors. First of all, most people aren't very good at thinking outside the box. So we have authoritarianism and this worship of law. Inside that, a whole bunch of people have written books about this is why these people should be on the throne, and these are the commands they should issue. And then the other side, which isn't even different, is no, these people should be on the throne and issuing these commands. And I think the reason there are a number of reasons that there are so few people who dare to say that whole game is bogus. Like, there shouldn't be a throne. Nobody should be on it. It shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be issuing commands. They shouldn't even exist. First and foremost is just the fact that it's very difficult for most people to think that far outside the box when everybody around them is still inside the status box. And it creates, like, there's two kinds of pressure that can make actual advocates of liberty shut up. One is when it's just direct. Like, I suspect that the people who own, you know, most record labels and own publishing companies are mostly statists. The reason I think that is because almost everybody's a statist. So just by default, anywhere in any industry, most of the people in power are going to be statists. And if somebody comes along and says, I think statism is totally bogus, start to finish, there's going to be a resistance there. It's sort of like if there's a publishing company owned by some devout Christian and an atheist says, hey, can I write a book? Like, no, go somewhere else. And you quickly run out of somewhere else's to go because it's one thing to sort of nitpick about the details of like who should be in charge and what policy should be and stuff. It's another to try to undermine the entire premise and say, the whole foundation of your worldview is bogus. Now, can I write a book for your publishing company? So part of it is, and this doesn't have to be like a conspiracy, like we're going to make sure people who don't agree with us don't publish. It's like if I owned a publishing company and some Nazi said, hey, can I write a book? I'd say, no, go away, because I think your views are stupid and idiotic. Go, you know, somebody else will print you. So part of it's not like they all get together in some dark room and say, let's not let voluntarists write. It's just the influence of people who own a business and who they want to do deals with. But on top of that, there's also sort of what I call self-censorship, which is when people know that they're in such a tiny minority in the population to begin with. Most people, just because we're social animals and just the way our psychologies work, they don't like saying things that alienates 99% of the world.
Yes.
And I actually think there's a need for antisocial weirdos like myself who don't care if anybody agrees with me. And in a way, I don't even think that's healthy. Like, I think as social animals, we should sort of care and get along and stuff. But I think there's actually a need for people who dare to say, I'm going to stand up and say what I think, and almost everyone's going to hate it. And I don't care because it's the truth. But that's very difficult for a lot of people, including a lot of people who are voluntarists and anarchists. It's uncomfortable to speak up if you know people are going to disagree with you and condemn you and attribute, you know, nasty motives to you and all sorts of stupid things that happens. And so people they don't wait around for someone else to censor them. They're just like, I'm just not really going to say it that loudly because I know how I'm going to be treated if I do. And it's a sad thing to watch because there are a bunch of people who know the truth, but will keep quiet knowing that, do I really want to cause another argument and more people to tell me how horrible I am and how I hate roads and want old people to die and, you know, all the stupid responses you're going to get. So a lot of people choose not to speak out. And there's no reason that wouldn't happen in, you know, publishing, just like it happens everywhere else. It's just people like, I don't really dare to say this out loud. Now, there is another thing, because you mentioned about musicians.
Like us, because we're musicians too. So.
Yeah. And it's funny because being both a writer and a musician, I think it's an interesting balance to have, because usually musicians
Yes.
tend to be more about emotions and right brain stuff, and that fits very well with anti-authoritarianism. Like, I'm going to write a song about how horrible it was that the government did this, and anti-war songs. There's 80 bajillion anti-war songs and anti-authoritarian songs and all that stuff, because it's about feeling an emotion. Whereas a lot of people who kind of instinctively understand that, they don't bother to get very analytical or philosophical. They don't even really have a philosophy, which has sort of been an annoyance to me over the years. All the people who can point to one example of authority and go, this is horrible that they're doing this, and their answer is, that's why we need my guy on the throne. I'm like, oh, no, come on. That's the best you can do, is a different guy on the throne. But that's because they haven't really thought it out. It's totally hit them in the instinctive emotional part of the brain, but they haven't really reasoned it out and spelled it out enough to realize. And when you're writing a book, it's less about, emotion and feels than music is. And it's more about, like, you can't write a book unless you have something to say on a whole bunch of pages. And writing down authority sucks, authority sucks, authority sucks. Like, you need a little more than that to have it be worth writing a book about it. In a song, you can say authority sucks, authority sucks, authority sucks, and it can be a good song. But you need a little more philosophical substance to make a book out of it. And so I think there's been a long tradition of anti-authoritarianism showing up in music, but in actually writing a whole book about it, because most people, even those musicians who say, this is horrible, they don't question statism either. So if they wrote a book, all it would be is, that guy shouldn't be on the throne, this guy should be on the throne. And there are a bunch of books just like that. From liberals and conservatives arguing about who should be on the throne and what their decrees should look like. But most people don't, like, they instinctively know something is horribly wrong, but their intellectual brain never gets all the way to the point where they realize, like I've said a million times, the problem is not who's on the throne. The problem is that there is a throne to be on. And if they don't philosophically and intellectually all the way figure that out, then they can complain till they're blue in the face about whatever the injustice today is, but they're still never going to figure out what the actual problem is, because they still think the guy in power right now is the problem. That's never the problem. He can be a nasty psycho and doing evil things. The problem is always the beliefs that are in the minds of his victims, thinking that this is legitimate and legal and all that stuff. But that's an analytical thing. But that's what I mean when I talk about default anarchists. Like, emotionally and instinctively, they know it, but they've never seen it spelled out as an intellectual, just logical thing. Oh, yeah, of course, that's why government can't be legitimate. And then it clicks and makes sense. But because most people aren't there yet, you don't see a whole lot of writers who are there yet, because you don't see a whole lot of anybody.
Right.
Still a tiny percentage of the population. But it is growing, and it's growing all over the place. And the more people who instinctively understand something is horribly wrong, the more people are at least capable of thinking about it and then having it become an intellectual thing too, until they match, until the emotion and the intellect match, and they both realize authority is basically the bane of humanity, on both, not just this particular regime, but the entire notion. And then when somebody, like you and I, who do music and we do the analytical thing, it sort of makes a complete picture instead of this sort of disjointed mess that doesn't really make sense. But most people aren't there yet.
Yeah, because like most people are like either left brain imbalance or right brain imbalance, like Mark Passio says.
Yeah, yep, exactly.
And would you agree in the case of nonfiction that the truth is just brutal and risky? Which is why there are only a few nonfiction works dealing with the subject, whereas it's a lot easier to convey the message through fiction, like say Orwell's or Huxley's stuff, and your stuff too, the Iron Web, plus a bunch of other dystopian novels. Yeah.
The Iron Web. Woo-hoo. Yeah, I think that some of that has to do with the fact that people are perfectly comfortable hearing about real world, like nonfiction criticisms of other regimes in other places. Like people can read a big book about how horrible Nazi Germany was, or how horrible, you know, Stalin's Russia was, because that isn't the authority that they were trained to bow to. So they can look at the authorities in other times and other places and say, well, yeah, that was horrible and people should have disobeyed, and I'm glad they had a revolution, you know, stuff like that. But when it's here and now, reading a book, a nonfiction book describing the evils of it, you know, not just a particular case of it, because there's a bunch of that. There's a bunch of examples of, here's a particular injustice that happened in the US. But to spell out why the entire thing is illegitimate, and you're spelling that out to the people who were programmed to see that particular ruling class as legitimate and the rightful rulers, that's literally like going to a religious gathering and saying, hey, everybody sit down, I'm going to tell you why the God you worship is the devil. And so it's automatically going to be really dang uncomfortable. And so most people, they don't have a problem, and you can see this in movies too. They don't have a problem with, here we're showing, you know, police abuse and we're bashing that. That's horrible. That's nasty. That shouldn't have happened. And here's some political corruption, and that's horrible and nasty. It shouldn't have happened. That's things that they're allowed to complain. They're sort of philosophically allowed to complain about. But when you say there shouldn't be government law enforcers and there shouldn't be politicians in a ruling class, that's something that makes people really uncomfortable. Because if you're nitpicking about the details, you know, fine. You don't have to question your assumptions. You don't have to question your viewpoint. You can just say, well, obviously the wrong guy is on the throne, or they gave the wrong guy a badge. But to consider the possibility that, no, the problem is that there is a throne and there are badges and there needs to not be those, that's so uncomfortable for people that a lot of them just can't process it. And that's why fiction works, because you can tell the story happening somewhere else. You know, here are these nasty oppressors, and they can go, yeah, because they weren't trained to bow to those nasty oppressors. So they can go, that's horrible. And I'm so glad. But there is the irony that I've pointed out before, is all these people go to the movies and they go to V for Vendetta or Braveheart or Equilibrium or The Patriot or The Hunger Games or, you know, 80 bajillion other things. And they see this oppressive empire and they cheer for the illegal law-breaking criminal rebels. And then they walk out of the theater and go, I'm a proud law-abiding taxpayer. It's like, oh, how did you miss that? How did you miss the connection? It doesn't matter how obvious they make it, you still miss the connection. And that's why when I wrote fiction and I wrote The Iron Web, I didn't make it in a different time and place. I made it here and now, and the bad guys are the actual bad guys in this country. It's still fiction, but it's supposed to make people uncomfortable by saying, no, I'm not just going to make you say, Nazi Germany was bad. I'm going to make you look at the evil that's being done here and look what would be done to people who actually want freedom for you and everybody else. But it's uncomfortable. And most people don't like thinking about that. They'd much rather, you know, have some feels enjoyment watching some movie about some other place in some other time and fail to notice any connection to here and now.
That makes a lot of sense, because I never thought of it all this, so that's why I thought I would ask you, you know, a fellow writer, you know. So, And speaking of writing, some more writing stuff here. Self-publishing is all the rage right now, as you already know. So, especially publishing transformational, spiritual, and business books that make a difference in people's lives. Yet nobody is writing about freedom and liberty. How can we inspire more writers and other publishing professionals to create works that promote and preserve freedom and liberty? Maybe we can come up with a new niche, like self-help for self-ownership, self-government. There you go.
Yeah. Again, I think part of that is just, it's uncomfortable for people to put out there an opinion that they know is going to be condemned and rejected and mischaracterized and everything else by other people. And some of us are like asocial enough that we don't care. We do it anyway. But I think and then there's the element of, if you're trying to make money off of a book, telling the entire population that their belief system is stupid, like it's hard to make money doing that. as I can attest to. And it's this weird thing that so many people would they want to read a book that makes them feel good or entertains them or
Yes.
agrees with whatever they already think. And if you're trying to like publish a book and make money off of it and actually have it sell, it's like, well, I'm going to go to, I'm going to go to Utah and tell all the Mormons how stupid their ideas are. Well, how much money you think you're going to make writing a book telling somebody their religion is stupid? And literally everything I write is telling statists that their religion, their belief in government is stupid and destructive. And it's hard to literally sell people something that they really need, but they really don't want, and they don't know they need it. And that's what we're up against. So an author like trying to be a successful author is like, well, let's see, I could write a thing that everyone's going to hate and have them all be mad at me and condemn me and stuff. Or I can write, something that might actually sell and make a bunch of money. And so that's why you have to be some sort of obsessed psycho like me, where it's like, if I'm broke and living in a cardboard box, I'm still going to write about this because this is what actually matters. But there's a pretty big incentive socially and financially to not write something that goes completely against the grain of what almost everybody believes. And that's a huge uphill battle. And some of us are just too stupid and stubborn to leave that battle. I'm just going to keep trying to climb this stupid hill no matter what. But yeah, I can understand why a lot of people don't really want to go that route, because it's not the easiest route there is.
Nope, but it's very important. But why is it more important, more than ever before, to speak up about all this through the written word and take advantage of the fact that there are no book burnings, at least not yet, while digital content pieces like videos and social media posts are censored or banned?
Yeah, it's one of the things I often try to emphasize to people who are already voluntarists and anarchists is that if you don't say something out loud, if you do say something out loud, you may be condemned and ridiculed. They may not pay attention. They may not understand it. They may call you names and whatever else. But if you don't say it out loud, the people in front of you may very well never even know that there is such an idea, and they'll never think about it. And that's why it's so important, even if you feel outnumbered and condemned and whatever else, to say it, because you never know who's there, who's going to hear it. They might even be somebody who at the time attacks you and says, that's ridiculous, and that'll never work, and blah, 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 blah. But you still planted a seed. And having been doing this for almost a quarter of a century now, I can tell you a lot of times when it feels like you planted a seed on a rock and you're like, well, that's not going to do anything, it actually did. Because I've met people, and some of them I met years later, and they've become voluntarists. I was like, you did? Like, as vehemently as you argued against me, and as thick-headed as you seemed to be back then, it sure didn't feel like I was making a difference. But it turns out that when people keep getting exposed to these ideas, eventually it sinks in. It's most uncomfortable to be the first one in line to introduce people to a new uncomfortable idea, because the likelihood they're going to embrace you or pay any attention is almost zero. They're going to react by, no, that's wrong, that'll never work, and some variation on that, or even, you're horribly evil for advocating no government or whatever. But when they hear it over and over again from you or other people, eventually they have to think about it. And so being the first in line, not always fun, not always comfortable, but it's really important that if you believe this, you mention it, even if you don't think it's going to do any good. Because I guarantee it won't do any good for you to not mention it.
Yeah.
So that's, the thing I always encourage people to do, people who are already voluntarists, is mention it in one form or another. And that's, incidentally, that's why I make things like this, little What Anarchy is booklet. So you can just hand it out. Like, if you're too scared to try to tell somebody what you mean, here's this dumb little animated thing that's, you can read the whole thing in like half an hour or something. And it spells it out. But if you don't ever do that, and incidentally, somebody I know just mentioned on Facebook that she gave one of these to somebody she knows, and by the end of it, they were like, yeah, that's me. I didn't realize that was me. So, and if she hadn't done that, if she hadn't just, gone to the great trouble of going, here, read this, like, that person would still be a statist and not know it and still be sort of confused inside their own head. So it's so easy to underestimate how much of a difference you can actually make if you just dare to speak up, even knowing that lots of people aren't going to react that well to it, or aren't going to pay attention, or are going to misunderstand you, whether accidentally or on purpose, misunderstand you. But it's still worth trying, because that's the only way we get from where we are to where we need to be. Is they have to be exposed to these ideas so they actually question the stuff they were taught.
Especially for people who are like us, who are introverts, you know?
Yeah.
Just have to speak up their very words. It's for everybody.
Yeah. And it's funny because I'm totally an introvert. And when I say that, a bunch of people go, "What? You're like loud, obnoxious, and talking in front of crowds." That's because it's something I believe in and care about. And most of the time I'm like hiding somewhere doing my own thing and don't really want to be around people. And it's funny how many people who are sort of into philosophizing and stuff are introverts, but we sort of, if we don't make ourselves find a way to get the message out there, then the message doesn't get out there. Nobody else hears it. So I'd make myself push my comfort zone to go do stuff. And that's, that was true from the beginning. When first time I, did a public talk about it, I don't even remember that because it was a quarter of a century ago. But I was like, oh, I'd rather just stay home and not do this, but okay, it's important enough. I'm going to go give a talk. And now I have like zero stage fright anymore, and I don't care about talking. I don't know when that happened, but at some point I don't care in the slightest whether there's one person in front of me
25 years.
Or 1,000. Yeah, somewhere in there, I just stopped caring about that. But I'm still an introvert and kind of antisocial. Well, I say antisocial.
Asocial is
the correct because I'm not anti-people. I'm just, I'll mind my own business over here. But I still make myself try to do things to get the word out, because it matters a lot whether people fall for this lie or not. As you can see right now there's a huge contrast between the people going along with these horribly destructive commands and the people saying, I'm not really sure we should be obeying these twists. So.
Yep. It's so important to me too. That's why I'm doing this interview. I'm still getting used to this interview thing. I'm still tripping over words and everything. I'll get better eventually. Just getting used to it.
Good.
And we're still talking about the publishing industry here. So here's my next question and discussion. And professionals in the publishing industry have been belly aching about government overreach, like the stupid law, the AB5 law. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's affecting people in California, freelancers, independent contractors. It limits your earning potential and autonomy. And there are also similar proposed laws in other states and even at the federal level now. I don't know if you've heard about that. It was approved in February. So these folks are getting these short end of the stick, and they're getting little economic assistance, as business owners, as freelancers during this pandemic. But they still support the system that has been royally screwing them time and time again, and they hold on to this belief that you have to be legit, you have to comply with the government to be considered real pros. Nobody talks about this in the industry. What would you tell these folks? And why is more government under the guise of helping people and concern for their well-being, which is supposedly the intent of the AB5 law, is never a good idea?
Well, and see, that's the uncomfortable step. Again, people can look at that a particular example of this law is hurting us, and let's go beg the politicians to please, repeal it or do whatever. There's a big step between whining about a particularly, oppressive or unjust thing and realizing that the people shouldn't have the power to do that at all. Like, nobody should have that power over the rest of us. And so it's already an uncomfortable discussion for a lot of people to have. And it's an uncomfortable thing for most people to even think about, because so often people think that, basically government is a big club, and like club hitting people over the head. It's the other kind of club too, but that's the kind of club I mean. And they sort of think, well, we just want the club to hit people over the head that we want hit over the head. And instead of having this law that hurts us, have that law that hurts the people who aren't us. And so few people are willing to give that up. and say, let's not have there be a club. Let's have actual freedom where, you know, a publisher can go do this and a writer can go do this and other people can do things differently. And there is no like centralized master telling us all how we have to do things and what we have to do. And that's just such a paradigm shift. Oh no, I coughed. Sorry, I have to joke every time I have a download.
That happens.
That's such a paradigm shift for most people that all they can think about is, we don't like this particular thing, we'd rather have that particular thing. And they don't, it never occurs to them that it's even an option to say, how about don't have the government do anything about anything? Don't have it, you know, forcing its centralized master plan on us at all. That way we don't have to bicker about what the centralized master plan should be. And we're not arguing about, I want this law that benefits me at your expense, and you want this law that benefits you at my expense. But that's sort of a quantum step that people have to make. And most people aren't ready to do that. They'd rather just bicker about this particular piece of legislation. Let's go protest this piece of legislation, or, you know, push, you know, write your congressman and have them support this. And they don't realize, as long as it's up to your congressman how much to control you and rob you and limit you and all that, you're never safe. You're never secure. They can do whatever they want. As we're seeing right now, they can literally put 30 million people out of business in a heartbeat. And people go, oh, well, it's the law. And luckily, a few people are like, man, I don't care if it's the law. I'm just going to ignore that law. And that's sort of the test of whether people are able to think outside of the status box and say, how about instead of begging the masters to please write laws that we like, we just ignore them? And that's the awakening that has to happen. And it's actually been sped up a whole lot recently.
Yes.
Because when you do something that's literally destroying the livelihoods of tens of millions of people, that is the point at which some of them are going to go, okay, heck with the law. Like, I'm going to do what I have to survive. And my respect for authority is out the window if respecting them means my family is going to be homeless and not have any food. And that's why I say, for the politicians to do this, it was just the dumbest move I've ever seen. It's like, you're making everybody hate you, and you're literally requiring that they disobey you if they want to continue to live.
And it's almost November too, election, like, whoops.
Right, that coming up. But it's still, it's a difficult step for most people to make, to, instead of bickering about this or that particular piece of legislation, get to the point where you go, they shouldn't have any power over any of that.
Right. And having said all of that, and talk some more about Candles in a Dark seminar and the concepts you share there. How can they benefit those have yet to wake up so they can snap out of their cognitive dissonance, realize their goodness, and unleash their inner anarchist or voluntarist that has been there all along? And yes, we're talking to you writers, authors, and publishing pros out there.
Yeah. So on top of all of the societal and psychological sort of hurdles to coming out and daring to say what you think when you know the rest of the world isn't going to agree, there's the fact that when the rest of the world is literally indoctrinated, it makes it, several extra challenges trying to get through to them. Because if you just say there shouldn't be any government and you own yourself and blah, 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 which, seems simple enough, like, why would anybody have trouble understanding that? And then you get these weird responses. You have to understand the psychology involved and understand that if you're trying to deprogram someone from a cult, which is basically what we're doing, the cult of government, you can't just use evidence and logic. It doesn't work. So when Amanda and I put together Candles in the Dark, it was based on a quarter of a century of talking to, I guess then it was only about 20 years, of talking to statists and step-by-step realizing how their psychology was making them literally unable to hear what I was saying if I just sort of spelled it out and explained it like, teaching someone how to change the oil of their car or something. Like, that doesn't work when it's something that's somebody's fundamental paradigm. It's how they see the world. You can't just explain A, B, and C, therefore your entire view you've had your whole life is completely bogus. Like, the human brain can't process that. And so Candles in the Dark was all about learning that psychology and then teaching people how to control their own psychology so they don't accidentally set off the other person's psychology and have it turn into an argument, which that's the natural thing that happens when you go and tell somebody, hey, let me tell you why your whole view of reality is totally stupid and dangerous. Like, people don't tend to react well to that. But they're, like you mentioned, voluntarist is what they are deep down inside. So this is the good news, the really good news. If not for this, I'd just be running off and hiding in the woods somewhere. Humanity is already anarchist and already voluntarist. That's what we naturally, instinctively are. But on top of that, we've been taught this authoritarian garbage that messes with what we know. Because if you say things like, treat other people the way you want to be treated, and don't attack people and don't steal their stuff, and don't be violent, everyone goes, well, yeah, no kidding, obviously. Like, we all instinctively know that people of a bunch of different religions, people of no religion, like, most of us have that in common, where we understand, yeah, don't commit aggression, and like, what's controversial about that? But then there's this authoritarian mythology we've been taught that goes on top of that and conflicts with it and squishes it down and says, well, except when there are constitutions and elections and legislation and these weird pseudo-religious rituals, then those people do have the right to commit aggression and rob us and for the common good and yada, yada, yada. So you have what people actually are, and then a layer of authoritarian indoctrination. And Candles in the Dark is about, when you're trying to talk down through it, it doesn't work. It's about trying to get to where you're talking to the internal voluntarist and inviting them to break out of the garbage they were taught. But if you come from the outside and you feel to them like you're this outside foreign nasty idea, and they think they're the good guys, which means, well, if you disagree with me, obviously you're the bad guy. So it turns into an argument. It turns into a fight. And Candles in the Dark is all about learning how to use your, control your own psychology, so you find within them the voluntarists that they already are. Mm-hmm. And just by asking the right questions and having the right approach, you be on the side of the real them as it tries to struggle through the layer of garbage that they were taught until it releases who they really are. Because it isn't about, hey, those people wanted to talk you into agreeing with them. I want to talk you into agreeing with me. It isn't about that at all. Candles in the Dark is the exact opposite. It's those people wanted to talk you into, believing them. I want to help you not defer to anybody, including me, not give anybody that much control over your brain and your view. I want the real you to come out and reclaim ownership of yourself. And the process is very different than a normal debate. Because, I've done debating for ages and I still do that, just knock down, drag out. Not at all gentle, not at all Candles in the Dark debates. I still do that for a different audience and for a different purpose. But that is not how you tune into the actual person you're trying to talk to and actually free them. And Candles in the Dark, it takes effort. It takes someone training themselves, because this didn't come instinctively to anybody I know, including me. My instinctive thing is to have debates, which, like I said, I still do that too. But to keep yourself in line enough that your entire focus and your motive is not to defeat them or beat them or show them they're right. Your motive is literally to free them from a lie. And when you can keep your own brain in that mindset and then know the questions to ask, suddenly the confrontation goes away and the arguments go away. And the one confrontation that's left is between them and them. Like, it's inside their own head, and they have to sort that out. And you're just sort of there to be a helper and a comfort to them while you bring them up to their own contradictions, and then let them go through the uncomfortable process of trying to figure out what they believe. But it's a very different approach, and almost nobody's seen me do it in public because they don't do it in public. It's a very different approach with very different results. And it's so on top. So, going back to voluntarism, on top of the fact that there's all this societal pressure to, sit down, shut up if you're saying what most of us don't believe, then there's the feeling of frustration of like, well, I tried to explain this to people and they're too dumb to understand, or it always turns into an argument or whatever it is. And that's why we made Candles in the Dark. is to get past that so we can actually communicate effectively. Because when you're talking about something, an ingrained paradigm that was trained into somebody, laying out some logic and evidence isn't going to be enough. It's just going to sort of annoy them and make them defensive. You have to understand their psychology better than they do, and you have to understand your own psychology enough to get there and to be effective. And that's why we made the whole course.
That's a great explanation right there. Most people wouldn't know how to do it until they're taught to do it. And I mean, your seminar is great for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and it's, like I said, it's not something that occurred to me. It took me years of doing it the wrong way until I started to notice there actually are ways that people will actually hear what you're saying. Because most of the time, if you challenge someone's paradigm, they literally can't hear what you said, which is why they come back with, weird, irrelevant questions, roads and stuff, is they literally can't hear it because it's too uncomfortable if you approach it the wrong way. They're fully capable of understanding it, but it has to be approached the right way so that they dare to look at it. And just a head-on, your belief system is stupid, that doesn't make them dare to look at it. It makes them defensive.
Yeah, it's like a non-violent communication, NVC.
Yeah.
Or C. I can't even enunciate or pronounce correctly for some reason. Talking too much, because we're writers. We don't like to talk, but we have to talk. Right? And what would you say to people who ask, what will we do without government? Who would take care of the poor and the sick? Who would build the roads? Typical one. Who would catch the criminals? Who would make sure businesses are legit, honest, and competent by ensuring they're licensed and incorporated?
Right. Well, that's a perfect segue, because that's often how people respond to the idea of not having a government. Well, how would this work? And how would this work? There are two very distinct things that happen when somebody asks that question. And I always immediately try to clarify in my own mind, which are they asking it for? One thing is, people often ask those questions not because they even want an answer, but because it's basically an excuse to not think about the principles. So if I say, like, it's not okay for me to advocate that you be robbed for something I want and you don't, even if I call it taxation, and it's not okay for you to advocate that I be robbed for something I don't want, and their brain is immediately uncomfortable, because most people, even something that simple, they've never heard of it. And they're like, and their brain wants to jump to, well, it has to be this way because I don't know how things would work otherwise. In other words, they are using their question as a psychological escape from having to look at the principle. And when somebody's doing it for that reason, I don't let it work. I literally just won't answer their question. I'll come back and basically say, well, are you telling me that you are going to advocate that I be robbed for things I don't want, unless and until I can explain to you how everything will work otherwise? Because if it's just an escape, an excuse to not have to look at the principles, I don't follow them. And that's one of the things in Candles in the Dark that we teach, is when their brain is trying to escape an uncomfortable thought, you have to gently bring them back to it instead of letting them just sidetrack you onto, an infinite number of tangents. But when somebody gets to the point where they say, okay, I understand it's immoral and it's illegitimate, but how would this work? Then I actually will entertain those questions and start to explain some possibilities of how it would work. Because then they've already acknowledged, it's not okay for us to treat each other. It's not okay for us to argue, all whine to the politicians to force our views on everybody else. That's not okay. But what will things look like when we don't? Then I'll actually entertain it. And a lot of the times it's just a matter of turning the question around and saying, well, what would you do about it? Like, here we are in a, no more 911, no more ruling class. Now we're just people. There's me, there's you, there's other grown-ups. What would you feel okay doing about, okay, there's some thief running around. All right, what do we do about it? And it is kind of awkward and uncomfortable to think like grown-ups and think, well, if there isn't some authority to whine to, if we're not thinking like little kids in a classroom anymore, like, I'm going to tell the teacher, if that's all there is, we're it. We have to come up with a solution. Suddenly people can start to think in those patterns and go, well, I don't know, I guess we have to catch him. First, we need to find out who it is and, you know, prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And a normal person will actually answer their own question if you just put it in terms of, well, what would you do? And it's not always easy and it's not always comfortable, because suddenly they're responsible. Like they're responsible for what they do, and they'd much rather dump that off on some, you know, dial 911 and let the authorities handle it, which is the immature child's way out.
Right.
And the responsible way is more uncomfortable, because it's like, okay, so what are we going to do about this? Well, maybe we could do this. Or whether it's, you know, whether it's crime or helping the poor, or what do we do about pollution, or, you know, a million different things. If people think like grown-ups, they very quickly learn, oh yeah, there are things we can do that doesn't require authority, but we kind of have to exercise our responsible brains, which we've been trained to not use. We've always been trained, don't take the law into your own hands, call the authority. We're literally trained to think like children instead of grown-ups. And so the process of having somebody realize, and you know, one of the answers I'll give is, well, I'm not going to be in charge. Why are you asking me? I'll be in charge of me when there's no ruling class, but I'm not going to be in charge of you. And then introduce it as a question of like, well, I can tell you what I might suggest or predict or what I might do, but what would you do? And then you start to have a discussion, and suddenly you're talking like responsible adults actually doing problem solving, instead of just asking, well, who are we going to get to fix all the problems? Because I can't. The childish mentality. But when they get out of the childish mentality, even most normal people can immediately come up with solutions way better than what government does in every case.
Yeah, I was going to say about something about that, but you beat me to it. Maybe because I gave you the notes. It's about becoming an author of your life and taking authority over it, you know, embracing self-ownership, stop giving up your power and responsibility, and stop believing in authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Be a true author. You know?
Yeah. And the thing is, it's, if somebody comes to the realization that, okay, government's illegitimate and robbery is illegitimate, even if you call it taxation, and thuggery is illegitimate, even if you call it law. And often the follow-up question will be, yeah, but they have all these enforcers with guns, so what difference does it make? And it makes a huge difference, because if you don't imagine them to have the right to do that, yeah, there will still be times when you'll probably obey just because you don't want a jackboot beating the tar out of you, or you don't want, you know, a tax collector stealing your house. But if you understand that that's not legitimate and it's not moral, you will start finding ways to work around that. Like, because if you know, there's a carjacker in your neighborhood, you don't feel guilty about like locking your car in the garage or something. It's like, I will do what I can to avoid your theft. But if the carjacker convinces you he has a right to steal your car, then you're going to, I proudly leave my car in my driveway unlocked with the key in it because I'm a law-abiding taxpayer. And when people's mentality changes and they stop imagining an obligation to pay tribute to a ruling class, then they start thinking of ways to not get robbed and not get controlled, and find ways to network with other people who believe in freedom and make their own economy, make a black market, make other ways to protect, like wherever I am. Sometimes I'm in Pennsylvania, mostly I'm in Arizona these days. The people I know around here, you know, if something goes wrong, they're not going to call the cops. They're going to call me. Well, most of the people I know are armed anyway, so they don't need to call anybody. But when you create a network and realize we don't want the parasites involved at all, like in Pennsylvania, I have a few neighbors who know dang well that if, you know, someone's breaking into their house or something and they call me, A, I'm going to be there a lot faster than the cops, and B, I'm not going to shoot them.
Yeah.
Like, or their dog either. Their dog won't be shot. And to authority, you're going to be their subject. Because you agreed to be their slave. Why would they serve their slave? You just gave them permission to steal whatever. That they're not controlling you in a way that benefits you. why on earth would they control you in a way that benefits you when you just gave them permission to treat you like property? But when you grow up and start acting like adults, suddenly we can think of solutions that aren't that difficult and aren't that difficult to do or to think up. But it's a completely different mindset, and most people have been trained to not exercise that part of their brain.
It's a lot of mental gymnastics involved. Okay. Can you still hear me now? Because it's kind of breaking up a little bit.
Oh, okay. There, you disappeared for a bit, but now you're back.
Oh, okay, good. So is your connection okay in there? Because it shows up, it's red. Okay. Let's talk about narcissism and psychopathy, my favorites, and how they're part and parcel of government. Government is the most malignant form of narcissism and psychopathy, and why is authority or government, how and why is so-called authority or government inherently narcissistic and psychopathic, making small government impossible or unrealistic?
Yeah, this was a thing that I didn't know that much about until Amanda had her
Yes.
with a toxic narcissist, and then we both read about stuff about that and realized, wow, this is a very predictable pattern, and the things they do, the triangulation and gaslighting and divide and conquer, and all the nasty stuff they do. And so we were learning about it. First of all, we were learning how predictable it is in individuals who do that. Like, they are so dang predictable. They do the exact same patterns. And I didn't realize it was that much just a template of toxic narcissists. You just go right down the list, and like every one of these is a perfect description of what they do. And then it occurred to me, it's also a perfect description of what governments always do.
Yep.
And that's not a coincidence. It really is a matter of if a human being, if their mindset is basically, I don't respect you as a human being, I basically just want to own you and control you, but you probably won't react well to that if I just say, if I just like chain you to a post or something and say, now you're my property, you'll probably react and fight and stuff. But if I can find ways to manipulate you and isolate you and make you feel helpless, and then make you feel beholden to me, and then make you not trust anybody else. And so these creepy, just genuinely evil processes that happen in the mind of a sociopath, a toxic narcissist type, also happens in government in exactly the same way, because it's the same pattern. Because it's like, how do I take this human being who they're trying to live their own life, they're trying to make their own choices, how do I make them subservient to me? How do I make it so I control them? And you can't just do it directly. You have to do it by deception and fear and manipulation, and triangulation is a big one. I'm going to make sure they distrust everybody else. And I gave a talk about this at Anarchy after learning about it, called The Nature of the Beast, which goes through how it's the same dang thing and for the same motive. And whether you look at, an individual toxic narcissist or an individual politician or government as a whole, they always function the same way, because their goal is always like, it's always control, but they can't ever sell it as that. Because if you come up to somebody and say, I want to dominate and control you, the person says, bye. So it's always, and it's the number of parallels is creepy. I started putting that talk together and I realized.
Yeah, like the battered spouse syndrome. Yeah, like abusive relationships, because I was in one. That's how I became an anarchist,
Yeah. And it's horrendous. It's a learning experience.
Yes.
Not a very fun learning experience, but a learning experience. But all the little things, like government, like the love bombing, the classical thing of toxic narcissists, is they start by, oh, I love you and you're so awesome and you're the most awesome thing and I just want to give you everything you want, blah, 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 blah. Government, we're here to serve you. We serve you. We're going to take care of you. We're going to make sure you don't get sick. We're going to, we just love you so much. And then that over time, once you become dependent and sort of, they have their grappling hooks in you, suddenly it starts to turn into something else. And
evaluation.
And now we're going to tear you down and tear down your individuality and tear down what you care about, but make you scared of everybody else. So you're still stuck with us. And it's creepy how similar the patterns are, but it all stems from the same thing. It's the antithesis of being a good human being. It's, I don't respect your self-ownership. I don't respect your free will. I don't respect your judgment. I think I have the right to own you, but I know you're going to resist if I do that openly. So I'm going to use all these slimy, deceptive tactics to manipulate you into bending to my will. And it's what every politician does. It's what every political party does. It's what government as a whole does. And it's what individual sociopaths and narcissists do, down to the details of the tactics they use. And it was so creepy to learn about.
I know, gaslighting, like you said, triangulation, divide and conquer, which is, that's what it's all about. And fear, obligation, and guilt, fog. They're sending their flying monkeys or their followers, trauma bonding and Stockholm syndrome.
Yep.
Creating dependency in victims or targets, stimulus checks,
Yeah, exactly. And they do it
all.
They try to keep you dependent. We'll give you this free, we'll rob you and make sure you can't take care of yourself. And then we'll get you dependent on us, which incidentally, Amanda went through exactly that, of somebody trying to make sure she couldn't take care of herself and trapping her so that she's dependent. And then like, yeah, but you're so lucky to have me. It's like, you're the one who built the trap, you liar. Been in the trap if not for you.
Yeah, and they isolate victims and targets. Guess what's going on? That's the lockdown, quarantine, isolation of targets.
Yep, about as isolated as you can get. And so government does the same thing. It puts all these taxes and regulations so you can't take care of yourself. And in this case, just directly puts people out of work and says, don't worry, we'll give you free money. Now that we ruined your life, we'll give you free money so that you're, dependent upon us. And you're going to be all thankful, never mind the fact that we were the problem to begin with. You're going to be all thankful that we're helping you by giving you some stolen money that we stole from somebody else.
Yeah.
To pretend to make up for the fact that we just utterly destroyed your life financially. And the thing is, normally, and the trick is seeing through narcissists when they play these games, and understanding the games is how you see through them and make them not work. And this attempt by government is like, that was such a badly veiled attempt at control. Like, and in a number of weeks, I mean, it's already happening, but in a number of weeks, everyone in the world is going to know that their solutions were way worse than the problem. The problem was statistically insignificant for almost all of us, but their solutions are a total catastrophe. And so, like, right now, they're just acting like a really stupid, incompetent narcissist who just, like, vastly miscalculated how this was going to go. And the thing is, that's what happens with individual narcissists too. Every once in a while they do something. It's like, how did you think that was going to turn out? Like they do the triangulation thing where I'm going to go to somebody you know and talk bad about you. And then I'm going to go to you and talk bad about the somebody you know, and to try to divide you and triangulate. Only then you talk to each other and you go, he said, what about you? And he said, what about you? And then the game falls apart. And the same thing happens with government. Is their government like, we want all these people to be scared of these people? Well, now with the internet, it's kind of hard to stop them from talking to each other. So now I can like literally jump online, talk to somebody in Russia and say, so do you want to like kill all Americans and enslave us? No, mostly want to live my own life. Ah, what do you know? Me too. Like, okay, I'm not scared of Russians anymore.
Yeah.
And so when the victims of narcissists can talk to each other, the game falls apart.
Yeah.
And you see that all over the place. And with the advent of, the communication technology we have now, it's just crumbling all around them. And I think things like we're seeing now is an act of just sheer desperation on their part, because they realize their game is falling apart. It's literally a desperate narcissist whose lies are falling apart right and left, and the tricks aren't working, and they do some stupid, desperate stunt. And, a whole bunch of us go, whoa, what is wrong with you, you psycho? And see right through it. And some people are still falling for it, but a lot of people who would fall for most of their garbage aren't falling for this because it's so transparently insane that a bunch of normal people it's like a narcissist who, plays the game carefully and does enough love bombing that the person doesn't even realize that they're in that kind of relationship. And then they do something completely overboard, which that also happened to Amanda. And suddenly she realizes, holy smokes, something is going on here that is not at all good.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to recognize that is the first step to getting out of it, is seeing that this is not a loving, caring person who cares what I think, and this is a creepy, I don't know what, trying to control me and own me. It's time to escape. And it's the exact same thing with government. When people realize the politicians aren't doing this to protect us, they're doing this for power, and they don't give a crap about us. So how about if we
It's all about supply, narcissistic supply. Yeah, getting it left and right.
Yeah, stop being their supply. And in the political sense, we're literally their economic supply. And our obedience is their power supply. And when we just decide, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore, the game falls over. And suddenly the narcissist, whether it's a ruling class or an individual, has no power when their potential victims see through it and stop letting the game work.
Yeah, gray rock them, gray rock devote. That's what I call it. Gray rock devote. Go no contact with them, so just gray rock at least,
Yep.
I thought I would talk about this, and thank you for sharing that part, because I've been, because I went through a narcissistic or psychopathic abuse myself. Like I said, that's how I got into anarchy. I was going through, at the same time I discovered anarchy, anarchism, voluntaryism. And I thought I would talk about this because June the 1st, I don't know if you know about that. That's World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day. And there are more people writing books and producing online content and narcissism and psychopathy, but not enough people are writing about the narcissistic and psychopathic dynamics in government. So I'm glad we get to talk about this, and especially with what's going on right now. We already know how it destroys the economy and causes starvation, and everything's upright, increase in domestic violence and child abuse. And this is a huge concern in support groups for survivors of narcissistic abuse and abuse by other disordered individuals. We're talking about borderlines, psychopaths, sociopaths are about the same anyway. Psychopaths and sociopaths. We're talking about double abuse here at the personal and global levels. So we already talked about how the cure, a government solution or a cure, proves to be deadlier. So we need to actually drive this point home.
Yeah. And there really is a very similar, like, the problem is very similar between the individual narcissist and government, and the solution is also very similar in the mind of the victim, because the individual narcissist will do this thing to try to make somebody emotionally attached to them and dependent on them and everything else, so that and make them feel alone, like alienate everybody else. So I'm all you have. It's the rest of the world against us, and I'm all you have. And the fact that I'm an abusive butthead doesn't matter because I'm all you have, and without me, you would be nothing, and all that gross game. And it can be very difficult and painful for somebody to say, as scary as it is, I'm cutting this off and I'm escaping this. And I don't know what's on the other side. I don't know where I'm going to go. I don't know what's happening, but I know I have to break this. And it's an uncomfortable step to all the way let go, instead of, well, maybe we can work on it, or maybe we can. And above a certain point, if someone's all the way a toxic narcissist, working on it does not help, because they never had any intention of helping you or helping you be fulfilled. They had the intention of owning you, and you don't negotiate with a slave owner. That's not going to work well for you. So, but to make that disconnect is very uncomfortable, just like it's philosophically and existentially uncomfortable for somebody to say, maybe I need to let go entirely of the belief in authority. Instead of begging them to change their policies, maybe I need to just drop my whole belief in that and disobey and resist if I have to. But that's such a big step that it's very uncomfortable and it's very hard for people to do. And it usually only happens when the abuser suddenly gets so overtly nasty that the person feels like they have no other choice. Like, I have to break this. Like, I'm going to freaking die if I don't. I have to break this. I have to get away. Even as scary as it may be, as much as I'm scared of the unknown and whatever else, this has to end. This cannot go on. I have to get away from this. And whether it's philosophically or physically and emotionally, it's the same solution. And it's traumatic for somebody to say, the thing that was so familiar and comfortable, I have to let go of it because the only other option is I get ground down until I'm nothing. And to make that step is really scary. Well, as
Yeah,
you know,
trauma bonding. There you go.
yeah, yeah, because all the trauma bonding and all the things that the control freaks do to try to make people feel trapped. And so the problem and the solution is very similar when you compare government to the individual narcissist. And it's all about the individual reclaiming their own self-ownership, that
Yes.
I'm not beholden to you. I don't owe you anything. You don't have the right to manipulate and control me. You don't have my best interests in heart. You are trying to grind away what is really me and make me into your plaything. I'm not playing that anymore. And so that process is the same whether you're talking about political authority or an individual. And, I know a bunch of people who've been through that process, both kinds. I know people in both categories. And there's so many similarities between them that it's creepy. On the bright side, when you recognize the similarities, you realize the solution is the same. You can learn from the, one from the other, that, hey, and that's why it's interesting that you said that going through that on a personal level helped make you into an anarchist, because there are very clear parallels between the two. It's about self-ownership. If you own yourself, you don't have any obligation to put up with other people's manipulations and control freak, psychotic garbage.
Yeah, I'm glad we talk about this once again. I can't stress it enough, because there's people, survivors of narcissistic abuse or abused by other disordered people, but they still believe in government. Like,
yeah,
you know,
yeah, and because they haven't seen the parallels yet. And it's sad because, the analogy even continues, because a lot of times the people who gravitate, for whatever underlying psychological reasons, they may gravitate towards people who are going to be abusive to them. And if they finally get away from one, they often gravitate to another one,
Yes.
unless they really recognize the underlying problem, which is exactly the same as, wow, that president is really abusive. We need a different president. It's like, no, it isn't that you need a different person abusing you. It's you need to reclaim ownership of yourself all the way, so nobody can ever do that to you again. And so it's the difference between breaking away from one particular person and finding somebody else. And a bunch of victims of it say, why am I always attracted to psychos? And it takes internal examination to figure out, I set myself up to be vulnerable to that. And this needs to change. It's not that I was to blame for being abused, because the abuser is always, they're the one doing the bad thing. So they're to blame, but I need to change what I'm doing, which makes it so easy for other people to abuse me. And that's why I focus on the belief in authority in normal people, not in how bad the people in government are. Yeah, they're evil psychos, but if you're not giving them legitimacy and power over you, then they have no power. You can take away their power exactly as you can take away the power of a narcissist, just by understanding the game and reclaiming yourself from them.
Yeah, so stop supplying them and supplying yourself.
Yep, exactly.
And we're still on this topic, and we're going to talk about your other book, How to Be a Successful Tyrant, which is now out of print. That's practically a manual on how to be a covert narcissist or psychopath. And you went into psychic mode too when you wrote this book. The chapter on how the government can even use something as mundane as the common cold as an excuse for more control. That was cool and scary at the same time. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, and I did, anybody can look up on YouTube. I just titled it Sound Familiar, where all I do is read from this book that I wrote 15 years ago called How to Be a Successful Tyrant, and it exactly describes what they're doing now. And with a certain thing we shall not mention. And it's funny because a bunch of people commented under that is, you gave them the idea. No, I didn't give them the idea. They've been doing the same things forever. And I talk about how they use things to be feared. They'll think of anything that people can be scared of and use as an excuse to grab more power for themselves. So How to Be a Successful Tyrant is actually written as if it's a manual for someone trying to be a tyrant, which is, it's obviously flippant and sarcastic, but it was fun to write it in that voice. So it's suggesting you can do this and you can make them all scared of this and grab this power, but you can never look like the thing that they should be scared of. You're posing as their savior, and you scare them with other things and say, oh, if I have lots of power, I can protect you from that scary thing. And the fact that I used as an example a virus that is drastically exaggerated to get so all I did in that video was just read from the book and then stop. I didn't even need any elaboration.
Please work there in the video, like, see, told you so.
Because it's creepy how predictable they are, because tyrants have been doing this for millennia. And so I am working on the second edition of typing that up and bringing it back into print. I don't know when that'll be done. I'm not even halfway through now. I'm basically retyping it and editing it and adding to it as I go. But yeah, I definitely want that out. And a bunch of people are like, well, I got to see that book. Especially after I read that one clip of it. And like, holy smokes, 15 years ago? It's exactly what this is. And it isn't, it isn't because I'm a prophet. It's because they've been doing this forever. And it's very predictable what they do. Even this particular thing, they do it over and over again. They did it with, like, not to this drastic and ridiculous a degree, but they did it with swine flu and avian flu and Ebola and anthrax and AIDS and the bazillion other things. You're all going to die if you don't give us power. Like, they've done that forever. And they do it with a whole bunch of things other than diseases too. But it's not that I was a prophet. It's when you study how they function, it's really dang predictable. And eventually you can write their playbook for them, which is what I did in How to Be a Successful Tyrant. Is this is how they think and this is how they function. So when it comes out exactly the way I described it, it's not because I had a magic crystal ball.
Right.
I know the games they play, and this is the game. It's like when you're playing chess against somebody and I'm going to do this and then you're going to do that. And then I'm like, they're that predictable when you understand how the narcissist psycho functions.
Yes.
Then you know what to expect.
Yes, they're moving the goal. Oh, we're going to let you out in 2 weeks. Oh, no. 2 more months. Yeah.
2 more, whatever. Yeah. And then we'll let you a little bit out. And then, it's predictable and horrible. But yeah, I got to get that book back into print.
Oh, definitely. So do you feel you're optimistic about this whole thing? Is there really hope for humanity? Because there are still sheep out there. You're still like hitting the snooze button when the houses are on fire. So it's just it's just like this magazine I got like last weekend. It was from a church I used to be part of, a denomination I used to be part of. Basically, one of the leaders said in the articles, follow orders, obey authority. And this is a church that actually talks about end times prophecy. I mean, watch out for the mark of the beast. Like, what? The contradiction is so big, And we kind of go back and forth. Is there hope for humanity? Some people who are claiming to be religious or spiritual, they drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, and they're total sellouts, and they're traitors to their own stated religion. And I didn't even make it. There's an audiobook of The Iron Web, and somebody I know in Germany wanted to take a clip of something that one of the characters says in the book. And he said, and I want to make an English version too. So there's a German version and an English version. And I said, well, you could just use the audiobook because I already recorded the whole thing. So they did it, and they edited out things about the story. So it's just the explanation. It doesn't spoil anything. You don't know what's going on in the story. It's just somebody explaining stuff. And they posted it under the title "Message to the Voting Cattle," and it's been posted under some other titles too. And I actually said, I'm not sure this is going to go over well because it's pretty nasty. It's really in your face. And I was amazed by how well it did go over and how many people are like, this is so awesome. I'm sharing this all over the place because it's not gentle or polite. But the reason I bring it up is it points out that, of all the people who call themselves Christians or Jews or agnostics or Muslims or anything else, most of them are lying. They worship the state first and foremost. And that's who they actually pray to. and that's who they expected to solve the problems of the world. And when there's a conflict between what their God says and what government says, they go along with government instead. Okay, well, then you think that outranks your God, which means your God isn't anything. Like, if politicians outrank your God, then what use is your God? So I got into it, I was amazed by how many people dared to say, wow, watching that video, I kind of felt guilty because, yeah, that was me. It was describing me. And some people commented under the video saying that. And I was like, holy smokes, that's like, I don't even expect people to admit that to themselves quietly when they realize how they've been duped. But for people to come right out and post a comment saying, yeah, that was me, sorry. I was like, holy smokes, well, I'm glad they made that video. Made a video out of it. Because what the religion that most people really believe in is government. It has nothing to do with what building they go to on Sunday. The commands they actually feel guilty about disobeying are the commands of law from government, because that's the deity they really believe in. That's the religion they really belong to. It also happens to be the most destructive, insane religion in the history of the world. So that's kind of a problem.
Yeah, same with atheists too. We don't believe in any God, but they worship the state.
Right.
And they celebrate their holidays, holy days.
Right. And they're the biggest hypocrites of all. I don't believe in a God, but we need a government to blah, blah, blah. It's like, you do so believe in a God. You just use a different word for it, but it has all of the same qualities as a deity, only just a horrendously evil deity. But yeah, and it points that out. It points that out in the rant too in the video, that atheists who believe in government are not atheists. They just don't call it a God, but they view it in every way like a God, and they worship something horrendously destructive and immoral. But it's uncomfortable for people to go through that, and it's whether we help them through it gently or by an in-your-face thing like Message to the Voting Cattle. Anything that sort of shakes their brain enough that it makes them have to think about it, I'm in favor of it. Like Candles in the Dark does it much more gently and peacefully. And trouble is, you have to sort of do that. Like, that doesn't really work as well in public. So it's sort of a one-on-one thing, which is why I teach other people to do it.
Yeah.
It's going to take me a while to talk to 7 billion people one at a time.
I know you're a lot more direct in your face, your social media posts.
Right. So in social media and debates and stuff, it's just wham, run them over with a bulldozer instead. But ideally, I think it's more can be done with a whole bunch of people having one-on-one discussions and doing the Candles in the Dark method. But in the meantime, I'll still run people over with a bulldozer.
Whatever works. You got to
Whatever
all
works.
tools, you know?
All of the above. Yep.
Yeah. So describe how letting go of the belief in authority makes people more moral, more intelligent, more creative, and more compassionate in general.
Well, there's two choices basically, and Candles in the Dark is designed to gently bring people up to the realization that you have two choices. You can either use your own conscience and your own moral code and your own judgment, think about things and what do I think is right, and what do I feel is right, what should I do, or you can defer to an authority and say, I'm going to do whatever they tell me to do. If you're going to do that, if you're going to do the second one, you might as well be a robot. Like, why bother to have a conscience? Why bother to have a moral code? Why bother to believe anything about right and wrong if you're going to defer to somebody else and let them decide for you? And so when somebody realizes that their own conscience has to outrank everything else in the world, then suddenly they start to feel empowered. And it's a little bit scary because suddenly there's responsibility.
Yeah.
But it's also very freeing because it's like, oh, you mean there is no law, there is no politician, there is no anything which can make it so I don't have to figure out right and wrong for myself. There's no shortcut. I have to rely on my own heart, my own mind, my own judgment, because in the end, that's all I have. If I choose to defer to some politicians or defer to some church or defer to whatever, instead of using my own heart and mind, I am betraying my own self and betraying what's right and wrong and just saying, I'm not going to take on the responsibility to decide what I should do. I'll let somebody else decide for me. And to me, that is the ultimate sin. It is literally giving away your humanity. to decide I'm not going to pay attention to my conscience. I'm just going to do what that person says. There is nothing more evil than that. And if you doubt it, read a history book and see what has been done by people who were just following orders and just doing what authority said instead of using their own conscience. And as much as we're taught that, like, well, if everyone just did what they thought was right, it would be chaos and mayhem. The exact opposite is true. There is chaos and mayhem when everybody defers to an authority to tell them what you do. That's when you get genocides, and that's when you get wars, and that's when you get, huge examples of oppression, is people saying, well, it's not up to me to decide, I'm just enforcing the law, or I'm just going along with the law, or I'm just paying my taxes and funding this giant machine doing all these evil things. And so the idea that there's something virtuous about giving away your conscience and deferring to somebody else, it's the most insane, evil notion that has ever plagued humanity. And it's why almost everything I do is focused around doing away with that law.
Mm-hmm. And stop being a baby and grow up.
Grow up, take some responsibility for yourself.
Don't let anybody clean your, change your diapers, so to speak.
Change your own now. Yep.
So how can people find your books online and access Candles in the Dark? Give us a good
There is, Amanda and I now have a thing called The Rose Channel, which is therosechannel.com. And that will be a subscription thing. There's some stuff that's only there for subscribers, and then there's some stuff there in public. Subscribing also gives you the entire Candles in the Dark seminar, the online version. If you just want the seminar and not ongoing subscription, not any of the other stuff, attendcandles.com is where you can just pay once and get the whole seminar. My books are now on Amazon. I kind of resent Amazon, but it's still where almost everybody goes looking for a book. So it's there. Also, we just added a thing to our own website where if people want to buy in bulk, they either want to buy a bunch of these to hand them out. You can also just buy one copy there, but you can get a better deal if you want to buy some to hand out to other people. There's like a deal for 100 and then a deal for 10 or whatever it is. Same thing with this little guy. What Anarchy isn't, is people can get them for like $1.50 each if you buy a bunch of them. So that's on our website. The bulk deals are just on our website. You can also find them on Amazon.com. And the Iron Web is now back in print. I'm happy to say somebody else paid to have it printed, and they're actually selling it. But with
wow.
So the Iron Web is back on Amazon now. Not under my name, but it's only under one listing because only one person has it. I don't really have copies of my own book in that case, but
yeah, I have your audiobook for that one. For that one.
Yeah. Yep. So there's an audiobook of that too.
Okay,
and and my other books are on there. There's a couple other ones still on Amazon.
Okay. So what else do you have on your plate? Latest projects, future speaking engagements and all that jazz and rock and roll, especially talk about Mirror, how that's going.
Yeah. So many things going on all at once. One new thing that I'll mention here that I don't think I've actually mentioned much in public. I think I mentioned it on Facebook at one point, the possibility we are trying to make the Jones Plantation into a full-length movie.
Wow.
A full-length live-action movie, that was not my idea. Somebody I know who's just getting into this, and he did an interview of me down at Anarchy, and then we've been talking, and he looked at the Jones Plantation, which is you can look that up on YouTube, look up my name and the Jones Plantation, little animated things like 15 minutes long. And he realized, wow, we could make that into a real movie and it could be seriously impactful. And so we've had several meetings now with him and planning that out. And we're getting to the point where we have to make the pitch to see if we can raise the funds to actually do it. So we've been working some on that, and I've been working on the screenplay of that because that I think could be really dang impactful for a lot of people to see that played out, as a real full-length thing. In the meantime, there's also the Mirror that I've been working on a ton, and I'm sure that's the biggest project I will do in my entire life. And it's still in the works, and it's still there's the script and there's the animation. I've been getting a bunch done more on the script when I can. There's also 3 other books in the works. And what else? I can't even keep track of everything I'm doing. And So I don't have that many in-person appearances scheduled because I try to not do them because I have so many other projects, writing projects I'm working on. There's another little animated video called In Liberty that I'm about done the script, and then somebody else is going to animate it. She's actually the same person who did the thing for the Jones Plantation, and the same person who did the animations for what Anarchy is, and these cool little things. So she's already agreed to do animation for that. So there's a million little things, but yeah, the mirror is the huge one that it's still many, many months off when that'll be done. But that basically does what we teach in Candles in the Dark, and it does it by itself with anybody in the world. And it makes it an interactive, individualized and personalized experience for the person. It isn't just lecture. It isn't just here's a video or somebody blabbing at you. It's all about asking them questions, and their answers determine where it goes next. And that, the thing's just a massive undertaking, but it doesn't feel infinite to me anymore. Which is,
it's kind of like choose your own adventure kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. It's a choose your own adventure, like times a bazillion, because there's so many different ways the conversation can go, and the script has to cover all of them. And we have to model and animate computer animation for the whole thing because you're going through this virtual world. So and there's a Patreon account for that I should mention if people want to, because when that's done, it's going to be given away to the whole world for free. So it's not an investment thing. It's not like I'm going to work really hard on this and then cash in. I'm going to work really hard on it and then give it away for free and make nothing. So there are a number of people who donate to so that I can have time to work on that instead of having to do random odd jobs, which I'm doing all over the place, that pay the dang bills. But yeah, there's a ridiculous number of projects going on. Some of them I'm not even allowed to mention out loud.
Wow, that's a lot on your plate. You can actually juggle all the plates.
Several plates with a pile on several plates. So I'm keeping busy, but yeah, in one way or another, they all focus. And I do want to get back to music. I want Amanda and I to finally.
Yeah, same here. I just have to put music in a back burner for now.
I know. I want to get to it because it's what I actually care about. I'm also most of the way done a video of mine it isn't just me ranting into camera. It's a little bit more of a performance, and I'm recording a soundtrack for it. It's like 16 minutes long and stuff, but it's more produced than what I usually do, and so that's an excuse for me to do a little bit of music. But yeah, I want to have time to do that, but there's sort of this end of the world going on.
Yeah.
It takes my attention right now, so
could write a soundtrack to it,
Yeah. And I get to try to do the soundtrack to the Jones Plantation movie, if that becomes a movie.
Sweet.
I've always wanted to do a full soundtrack and never had a chance. So yeah, that'll be.
Woohoo! So any last thoughts? Okay.
I will end with the thing that I often end with, which is if you're an anarchist or you're a voluntarist, it is so easy to not speak up and not do anything, and you won't make a difference as long as you do. And even if it's uncomfortable and you expect backlash and you expect criticism and everything else, do whatever you can in whatever degree and whatever situation you find yourself in to at least plant little seeds in people's minds. Like I said, that you may be the first person they ever hear about this from, but you won't be the last. And if you're the one to start it, might be uncomfortable. They may not react well, but it's very important that you plant the first seed in whatever way you can, whether it's talking to them or asking them questions or handing them a copy of, The Most Dangerous Superstition or pointing them to a video or something. But if you remain silent, you're basically letting them continue to believe a lie,
Yes.
which is harming them. It's not even nice to them to not challenge their own paradigm because they are enslaved by their own indoctrination. It's actually doing a disservice to them to not speak up and not mention anything. And as uncomfortable as it may be, make yourself do it because it needs to be done.
Awesome. And thanks again for joining me, Larken. That was a blast. That was a hoot and a half cubed, not just square, cubed.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for watching. I hope this discussion will plant a seed in your hearts and minds. Remember to take a nap, NAP. non-aggression principle. Until next time, stay safe from statism. Stay awake and stay free.